and get in. Well, good evening, friends. This is the first time that I want to make sure that that's on mute. It is great. I can close that. This is the first time that Linus and Luis have been able to join us, and um, they have an opportunity to introduce themselves here in a moment. Linus and Luis had been members of our community for many, many, many years and have recently moved to the north side of Houston and and live in the Woodlands. And as of Friday, are now officially new members of Hope Presbyterian Church. And so much like Kitty, who lives in Garland, and John Seaman, who lives in San Antonio, who are active members, Kitty, who's a deacon in our church, and John Seaman, who's an elder in our church. Lennis and Luis are members who live in the Woodlands and will be members of our community. And so we're glad to have them and participate with us in worship and in Christian education. And but since you are jumping in, and I have been able to send y'all the chapters and events, but also, Luis, I see that you have the book, and so that's wonderful. You've just as some housekeeping notes, you saw in the handout, this is recorded, and so it's live on the YouTube right now, and so it'll be available for those of you who want to go back and watch it again. Most of what we're doing is meant for you to read. I want to encourage you to read it early in the week, and then when we gather together, there are some guiding questions for you. I want you to use these questions as an application for each of the chapters that you read, and then come with some thoughts related to them. And then we're just going to have an open conversation related to them. Today, what we've noticed in reading some of these chapters is they're not always the easiest chapters. These sermons are not always the easiest to read. They were sermons that he went back and readapted as essays, and some of them aren't the easiest in the world to read. So we'll muddy our way through them and do the best that we can. These two in particular that we're reading today, chapter 4 and chapter 5, he wrote in the context of while he was incarcerated, while he was in prison. So he wrote these two while he was in prison. We have been doing an opening prayer. So if you have that handout, I have been leading this opening prayer, but I have, in today's handout, have worked on reworking it so it's a little bit easier to read. And if somebody would be so willing to open us in prayer, and then I've offered some prayers as a suggestion for us at the end, that if somebody would be so willing to open us in prayer.
I can do it, Josh.
Thank you, Matthew.
Pleasure. Okay. O God, our eternal Father, we praise you for gifts of mind with which you have endowed us. Teach us, we pray, how to use this great gift of reason and imagination, so that it shall not be a curse but a blessing. Grant us visions that shall lift us up out from worldliness and sin into the light of your own holy presence. Through Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen. So the way in which we've been doing introductions is say your name, and then the Stephen Colbert, the Late Show with Stephen Colbert, has this little thing called the Stephen Colbert Questionnaire, and we've been plugging our way through his 15 questions. The question of the day is, what is the scariest animal? And I will we'll do this by mutual invitation. So I'm going to start off with Matthew. If you'll just say your name and answer the question, and then you can invite whomever you would like to invite next.
That's really tough. I can do the first part easily. My name is Matthew Russell. I've been coming back to the Hope Presbyterian for many months now, and I'm glad to be here. And the scariest animal. Uh, I have to think about that for a moment, I think. I'm not sure. I'm not really sure. It's hard to say. I could say something funny, but I'm not sure what the scariest animal really
You can
is.
go funny.
Maybe I would say, honestly, like a snake, I think is a little bit scary for me. I have a kind of a little phobia about that, me and Indiana Jones. So
All right.
thank you.
If you'll
And then
invite.
and then I will pass it to Kitty.
I'm Kitty Cosada. My scariest animal is the javelina. We had those on our property in Arizona, and the tusk on those things is plenty scary. Marcelo?
My name is Marcelo, and this morning my scariest animal was a brain-eating amoeba, but I'm not sure that counts. So just in case it doesn't, I'll change it to brown recluse spiders because I saw what a bite did to a fellow camper once, and it was horrifying. Oh, sorry, I was supposed to pass it. Who's remaining?
Linus and Luis or Julie?
We'll go with Luis.
Okay, my name is Louise Denilavicus, and we've worshiped with faith, with hope for about 10 years before having to move here to the Woodlands because of Lennis's doctors. And it was a decision that we didn't make while about joining the church. It wasn't a decision that we made while we were there. It took us a long time. I think it took me a long time to make that decision. But now that I've made it, I'm thrilled. And I guess the scariest would be a snake for me. There are no snakes in Hawaii. And so that is something that would just frighten me. Lennis.
Okay, hi, I'm Linus. I belong to her. The scariest animal I have in mind right now is our Staffordshire Terrier asleep here on the floor. We just rescued him. He's 5 months old and is actually a wonderful dog, but has his terror moments. If you don't want, constantly watch him, i.e. he just chewed through the leash.
Oh,
So I've got to go find something sturdier this evening before PetSmart closes so I can whack him tonight.
All right, Julie.
Yes, I'm Julie Pratt, and I've got a thing about bats. I know they do a lot of good in the world, but they creep me out. Seriously.
Okay. I'm Josh, and I will go with either me before coffee or ostriches. I don't want to have anything in the world to do at all with ostriches. I don't have any pleasure with them at all. So let's dig into chapters 4 and 5. I hope that for y'all, it was a little bit, as you've been, for those who've been reading along, maybe getting into a little bit more of a rhythm in understanding of how to get into his cadence. I thought maybe what might be helpful in thinking about these questions and the, one or two main takeaway points would help to illuminate these points, what are lingering questions that you might have, and thinking about how is it, and again, wrestling without, he wrote these things to a particular community in a particular time and place 60 years ago. But as they are sermons and God has spoken through him, in what ways is God still speaking through these sermons to us in our time and place as we engage them? And what I thought I'd do differently tonight is to look at them and let me run through a few highlighting points and maybe kind of begin to pull out from y'all some of what you think are, let me give a little bit of a highlighting of some of the main points of the flow of what I think he hits at. and then open it up to some general conversation. His main focus here is talking about his crucifixion on the cross and being his final word, in his final moments, that after being whipped, humiliated, mocked, being nailed to the cross, being pulled up, and at that moment, from Luke 23, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And he leads off with the invocation of this underscoring of the word "then," that at the crucible of that moment, that Jesus in that moment had, as in his full humanity, had the opportunity to do what I think so many in a human state would have done, which would have scorned, derided, or turned inward and decried their suffering. But in that moment, or if you look there on in that opening paragraph, then when he was being plunged into the abyss of nagging agony, then when man had stooped to his worst, then when he was dying, then the wicked hands of the creature had dared to crucify, then might have been otherwise. But in that moment, he turns to a prayer of supplication for those who are doing these most dastardly deeds to him, and asks God the Father to bestow forgiveness upon those who were condemning him. And King is elevating this up as a model of how we are to respond. The next page, looking in the section 1 there, he talks about that there's these lessons that are being for us to be gleaned from that in our life. One, he says, first, it is a marvelous expression of Jesus' ability to match the words with his actions. One of the most great tragedies of life is that humanity seldom bridged the gulf between practice and profession, between the doing and the saying. A little bit further, how often are our lives characterized by a high blood pressure of creeds and an anemia of deeds? We talk eloquently about our commitment to the principles of Christianity, and yet our lives are saturated with the practices of paganism. What do you think he's elevating here when he's talking about the gulf between the practice of profession, the gulf between practice and profession, between doing and saying, the blood pressure, a high blood pressure of creeds and an anemia of deeds? What do you think King is trying to highlight, underscore, and drive home here?
That we seldom do what we profess as Christians. We talk the high road, but a lot of times we take the low road.
At what point, though?
Individually or as a society, or what?
Yeah. At what point?
When it gets hard.
Yeah. Then.
Yeah.
King saying, at the moment when it really matters.
Yeah. When it gets hard.
At that moment when it really matters the most. Do you remember one of the sermons from a few weeks ago? He was talking about this idea. Actually wasn't in I got confused. My son's been working on a project he's in a class called African American Studies, and the project that he's picked for this month of Black History Month is African American music, 10 movements of African American music from plantations to present day. And one of the songs that we were exploring is a song called "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." If you haven't heard it, it's a wonderful song. And we were exploring the depth of it. And the artist is talking about, you won't be able to stay home and be a part of the revolution at the same time. You can't just have a sticker on your car and say that you're a part of the revolution. You can't just post it on your Facebook and say that you're a part of this. You can't just affirm it in church on Sunday, but when the moment comes and say, yeah, I think that's a great thing, and then not be a part of it. When the moment comes, there's a king is underscoring here. When the moment came for Jesus to walk the walk and talk the talk, at that moment, then there was not an anemia of deeds. It was met in the moment there. On the next page there, he digs in further. Jesus at the top, or at least on the top of my page, Jesus, the paragraph starts, Jesus also admonished his followers to love their enemies and to pray for them that despitefully used them. A little further down, their lives had been conditioned to seek redress in the time-honored tradition of retaliation. Now, in the next sermon that we're going to examine, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the idea about loving their enemies. I'm going to go to the third paragraph on that page. We sense the greatness of this prayer, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Father, forgive them. King writes, we sense the greatness of this prayer by contrasting it with nature, which, caught in the finality of her own impersonal structure, does not forgive. So now nature is setting up, he's setting up this contrast between God and humanity and nature, this thing that where there is choice, that we have agency to extend forgiveness. There is decisions. We have a choice in which we can extend forgiveness versus nature, which is unrelenting, which doesn't have this agency in which it forgives. Nature is just what it is. In spite of the agonizing pleas of men, trapped in the path of an onrushing hurricane or the anguished cry of the builder falling from the scaffold, nature expresses only a cold, serene, and passionless indifference. Nature must honor everlastingly her fixed, immutable laws. When these laws are violated, she has no alternative except to follow inexorably her path of uniformity. Nature does not and cannot forgive. Or contrast Jesus' prayer with the slowness of man to forgive. We live according to the philosophy that life is a matter of getting even and saving face. We bow to the altar of revenge. Last sentence of that paragraph. The potential beauty of human life is constantly made ugly by man's ever-reoccurring song of retaliation. So let's explore this a little bit more and what King is underscoring here with the idea of Father, forgive them, and Jesus's elevation of that prayer, Father, forgive them. How do you come to understand what King is talking about with regard to Jesus's prayer of Father, forgive them? And how is he illuminating that through this idea of of him elevating nature's cold, immutable laws and man's ever-recurring song and desire for retaliation?
That's a deep question. I have a way of reading it, Josh. I don't know if I can jump in and say something. One of the things that I think we read in the statement from the cross is the temptation to see into that an experience of loneliness and isolation in the midst of society, in the midst of nature and the world. And I think revenge and retaliation comes from that sense of isolation, being separated from things that are meaningful and to the word of meaning from that's directed towards us. So I kind of read these passages as King saying, we see nature that way, we see society that way when we feel isolated in a moment of tragedy, as from the cross could be read that way. So I don't agree with King when he's saying nature is somehow cold and impersonal. I think because nature is the creation of God, and I think that we see it that way when we feel isolated from it. We feel there's a veil between it and us. Um, so I think that's kind of an origin of revenge and retaliation, that somehow we feel cut off from the things that would comfort or be meaningful to us.
Yeah, I don't have any problem if you want to disagree with King, or if you want to articulate a disagreement with King. I think that's the whole point of why we're gathered together in conversation. So, please, absolutely. I think there's certainly some understanding there with regard to maybe he's just being illustrative, but um, the idea that if I drop a brick, it's going to land on my foot. I mean, the laws of nature are the laws of nature. And I had to spend some time reflecting on that paragraph, um, because I was thinking about how often we make the argument of the hurricanes, how often humanity makes the argument that the hurricanes and the tornadoes and the thunderstorms and the floods, that these are the things that either A, God has sent, or the things that God has protected us from. And according to the theology that King is putting here, is that the nature is nature, that these are that they're governed by the laws that are set forth in the natural order and the movement that has a part of the earth. And that um um I can't remember, I think it was after Harvey. I was in a room with uh it was an all hands on deck gathering of all the clergy and all of Austin, as many who would answer the call for an organization that I won't name because I have it on record. And it was all hands on deck, Hurricane Harvey. So we all came, and you know, and upon arrival, I realized that the gender in the room was pretty much like me, and the the clarity of the color of the skin of the folks in the room was pretty much like mine. Um, and there were, 150 folks in there. And then a female in a collar walked in, and heads turned kind of like she had just walked in the saloon with the double doors. And it was like, you ain't from around these parts, are you? And as they were getting started, the leader of the organization wanted to lead off with celebrations, because they were so proud that, as predicted, the weather forecasters, we had all geared up because we knew that Hurricane Harvey was going to hit Austin, and we knew it. And we were all gearing up for what that was going to mean. But their organization, they rallied, and they were so proud. They did a 24-hour prayer vigil, and they put up a shield of protection over this city, and they sent that hurricane to Houston, and it protected our city, and it prevented us from having to endure the damages. um, and God blessed us. I mean, there's just so much, there's so much to unpack there. And that, when I read this about what King is saying here, it recalled that story to me, and the manipulative aspect of theology, that I think could trigger some, and the ways in which he could, that might not necessarily be things that people would agree what he's saying there. And taking it at face value for what he is writing and what he's saying there, he's setting up this contrast between, I mean, at the end of the paragraph, basically, I mean, the point is what he's making is, um, nature, the storms come, the storms don't, the storms blow where they're going to blow, but you can choose whether or not you're seeking and exacting revenge. You have that agency. And I love what you were talking about with regard to isolation. And because when that cross got erected, he's the only one nailed on that cross. There might have been two other dudes nearby on crosses, but he's the only one on that cross. And there is isolation on that cross. And we all know what that feels like. Kitty, were you going to say something?
Yes, I was taking it as a contrast between forgiveness. Forgiveness is a permanent thing. It is not just a one-time thing. It should be a permanent thing. And then I took that the nature cannot forgive. Nature is just nature. And did I get off base there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would maybe I don't know that you are. I mean, in my mind, I would just think the word I'm using for nature is unyielding. Um, I mean,
But it's not able to forgive.
right. I mean, that's what makes it I mean, there's no humanality aspect of nature,
Right.
right? There's no aspect in there that could offer forgiveness in that regard. Having had sustained a number of home insurance claims related to water damage, our family has um, a saying that we see through our teeth, through clenched teeth. Water wins every time, and every time water wins, right? There's nothing about water that is good, bad. It wins and it damages every time, and yet we can't live without it. Um, 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 but he's setting up this idea about the agency that you have for forgiveness. Julie or Linus, Marcelo, Luis, do y'all want to say anything or add anything to this?
Well, first of all, since we're jumping in a couple weeks late on this thing, on this course, when I picked up the book and started reading, and I haven't read chapters 1, 2, or 3. Louise, I'll give her a gold star. She jumped ahead of me, and she's gone from 1 through 5, so she's a bit ahead of me. So, but my impression of this is how appropriate this selection is. And I looked at when these were written. So these were written 1963 or earlier. And we move forward to today, and they're as appropriate today to be sermons said from a pulpit as they were then. That's the one thing that strikes me the most. Now, getting back to this one paragraph that we're reading about the nature, I looked at it and said, well, no, that's, his comments about nature being unforgiving is true. And that only we as mankind have that choice. And very infrequently will we take the opportunity to forgive. Mankind mostly will want to retaliate. We hear that language today, right? Which is a shame. I think more people need to read this and reflect on this, on these sermons.
Yeah. The news is all about retaliation every day.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's never discussion of forgiveness.
Nope, it's always retaliation.
I don't want to take this in a different direction, but that was my impression.
These two sermons are going to tie together really well under a same theme. Turn the page to the little bit of the section. So just at the end of that big paragraph there, the last sentence, there's this haunting sentence for me. Capital punishment is society's final assertion that it will not forgive. And he's building up to this idea about humanity's bloodthirst for revenge, culminating with capital punishment and society's final assertion that it will not forgive. Such is the persistent story of mortal life. The oceans of history are made turbulent by the ever-rising tides of revenge. A little further down, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. In spite of the fact that the law of revenge solves no social problems, men continue to follow its disastrous leading. History is cluttered with the wreckage of nations and individuals that pursued this this self-defeating path. How do as Linus was talking about, bringing this more in this kind of contemporary, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to pivot to his second point and get to the second sermon tonight. But finishing up with the first point here with his first prayer, Father, forgive them. Jesus, this point of deeds and actions, that what we say is pairing with what we do, that we're elevating this prayer, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, and meeting it at the moment when it matters the most, and contemporarily elevating this up as Linus was bringing us there. In what ways do we see that there is a normalization, of this idea of an eye for an eye, the lex talionis, this idea that this is, or even if in the headlines from this week, where might we see examples of this is the way of the world? Where might you take this and apply it to these are the ways of life? Where his condemnation, history is cluttered with the wreckage of nations and individuals that pursued this self-defeating path.
Well, everything that's happening in the Middle East.
Right.
They killed 3 of our soldiers, so we unleash the bombs on them.
Yeah, we retaliate.
Yeah.
That's an example.
Yeah.
And there's a whole ethical conversation to have about that is one that we're not able to have tonight. And I juxtapose that decision with this paragraph. And I wonder if I were in the one who had to make that decision as a steward who's been empowered to make a decision on behalf of the nation, such as the person who's elected to be the president and has to make the phone calls to the families, who's entrusted with the shepherding of the nation. How do you justify, how do you reconcile an appropriate measures of retaliation? Go ahead.
I think he's thinking that for the survival of the nation. Yes, he retaliated, but what are the options if we do nothing?
Sure. And then how much is too much? So another possibility, again, too much for us to discuss, is an example of the difference between the Hamas attacks on Israel and how many the terrorists killed in response to the grand total number of persons who have been killed by Israel's retaliation, and the numbers who suffered from that. Is that do you make that a just retaliation? Is there a bloodthirst enough? And the protests that have arisen out of that is one that is saying, uncle, that is one that is saying, we well exceeded and have gone way more than, have met some sort of merited response. Um, and I think what King is saying here is this idea of the wreckage of nations and individuals that pursued the self-defeating path of revenge uh, continues to lead to disastrous results. And perhaps maybe that is the way of the world. But then again, perhaps maybe the call of Christ and the following of Christ is to blaze a different path at the time when it matters the most. What King has illuminated as then, 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 at that moment when he was elevated up, when he, above all, the sinless one, had the moment above all and the right to exact revenge above all, offered a prayer for his persecutors. This next section, section 2 here, and moving on into 3, I have to admit that I read very excitedly, because he very much touches into areas that are very core to my heart. The second lesson talks to really underscoring the second part of Jesus' words, for they know not what they do. What is King saying, what he means by that? They know not what they do. What is he saying that Jesus means by that, Marcelo?
They're not necessarily doing it overtly, like out of hatred. They might just not like literally understand. They're stupid, basically. They're lacking the what's the nicer way of saying that?
He calls it blindness.
Yeah,
Yeah.
blindness. They're lacking the information that they need to make an educated decision or an educated action,
Yeah,
take educated action.
yeah, you called it ignorance, and I wish the word ignorance wasn't so derogatory, and we could just accept it for its definitive usage, because ignorance is just a lack of information. And I have no problem acknowledging the ways in which I have ignorance, and that I am ignorant. There's just things that I don't have information. And he really gets into understanding the idea that there are people who do bad things because they lack information. There are people who do evil things who have been led astray, who have been informed with bad and evil information. Top of page 43 for those of you who have it. And I recognize that our books and our book numbers may be out of alignment. They know not what they do, said Jesus. Blindness was their trouble. Enlightenment was their need. We must recognize that Jesus was nailed to the cross, not simply by their sin, but also by their blindness. Down towards the bottom, last of that second paragraph. And so Jesus' words from the cross are written in sharp-edged terms across some of the most inexpressible tragedies of history. They know not what they do. This tragic blindness expresses itself in many ominous ways in our own day. Some men still feel that war is the answer to the problems of the world. They are not evil people. On the contrary, they are good, respectable citizens whose ideas are robed in garments of patriotism. Let's highlight that for a moment. Matthew, I'm going to pick on you because your face gave you away and you went, you did that. Did you see what I just did there? Did you see that? You went,
Yeah, I did do that. No, I know I did.
I'm watching you. Now, I read that. On the contrary, they are good, respectable citizens whose ideas are robed in garments of patriotism.
Yes.
Now, explain the face that gave you away.
Well, I mean, this could have been written yesterday, it could be written tomorrow. I mean, these are kind of things that we see all the time. I mean, I feel I'm a different kind of audience, I think, for these essays because I can get a lot of his references. And the key for me is in Jesus's phrase, they know not what they do, that connection between what they know and what they do and out of sync. And it's it makes you wonder where the root of the blindness is in our condition, in our potentially fallen condition. What is it? And is it from society? Is it again feeling isolated somehow from God's love and the truth within that? I think that, yes, I mean, in a more banal way, yeah, robed in the garments of patriotism. I mean, all we have to do is watch the news and we see those who espouse goodness on their lips, and then their actions betray their intentions. So it's, yeah, I had that kind of visceral reaction to it, I suppose. But it's also, I think King is calling us to account and saying that there's a part of that that's within all of us too,
Yeah.
that we need to be aware of our own. When he says they know not what they do, he's not just talking about these people, he's talking about us too. And there's something that connects us to that.
Cool. Love it. Good. What else? Who else hears these words and has a reaction to it? They are good, they're not evil people. The contrary, they're good, respectable citizens whose ideas are robed in the garments of patriotism. See, Matthew, even again, you just shook your
I
head.
know, because it's just so, everything he says is so timeless. It's so much just, we see
What
it
do you
all
think?
around us.
Who else responds to that? Okay.
I think they also were good people that put him in jail,
Uh-huh.
that he is doing the forgiveness. I can see him writing that about himself in his current position.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Right. You remember and Paul gets imprisoned, right? And there's an earthquake and the gates open and Paul can escape. And what does Paul do? He stays in prison. He doesn't flee because that would be the end of the jailer. So Paul stays, right? And I think in some ways there, not only Paul's integrity of not leaving, but I think there's also in my belief, and I don't think I'm alone there, that is also compassion for the jailer. Sort of what you're saying there, Kitty. All right, this is where this is going to take a left turn, or a right turn to Albuquerque. Yeah, I couldn't help but read this sentence and not think about this very, very, very visceral moment in the recent life of our country after this tragic event in Charlottesville, where there was this rally and Heather Heyer had been killed because she was run over. She was in a protest, and there was this bad dude who did a very evil thing and ran his car into a crowd and ran her over and killed her. Do you remember that story? Right? And that was horrible. And candidate Trump had come out from the Trump Tower in front of reporters. Do you remember what he said at the elevator, the golden elevators?
Yeah, there are good people on both sides.
He said there were good people on both sides. And the world went crazy. And I mean, I'm not going to get into the idea of executive communication skills and media training and how polished or not polished someone like him is or isn't. There's an aspect of that I felt like I understood, and there's an argument there that I felt like I understood. There was a bunch of ignorant persons protesting the dismantling or the taking down of the Robert E. Lee statue at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And King is talking about them in this paragraph 50 years in advance. He's talking about them, and he continues for several pages talking about those people 50 years later, people who have been poorly educated, who are just not informed, who even if you read the top of page 45, and this I think helps me understand. The paragraph starts, so men conveniently twisted the insights of religion, science, and philosophy to give sanction to the doctrine of white supremacy. Soon this idea was embedded in every textbook and preached in practically every pulpit. It became a structured part of the culture, and men then embraced this philosophy not as the rationalization of a lie, but as an expression of a final truth. They sincerely came to believe that the Black person was inferior by nature and that slavery was ordained by God. You were talking about an institutionalized structural lie that became so inherently acknowledged as the truth that it permanently embedded cataract on their intellect and on their spirituality, that prevented them from being able, in the hardening of their hearts, from intaking more information and to helping them to acknowledge what is truth and to separate, delineate between truth and the lie. And here we have this moment in Charlottesville that I feel like part of what King would say here is that inside of those young people in khakis with tiki torches, you have people who are made in the image of God, who are doing bad things. Person driving that car is still someone made in the image of God who did a very bad thing. That is not me endorsing that there are good people on both sides. And I think part of what we read, and we're reading King here as he's getting into this, and certainly into the next chapter, is that is not to wholly write off those who do these evil deeds as somehow not as those not still made, as those no longer made in the image of God. Yeah, I know Linus has to go. Um, what are your reflections on that? How does that strike you?
Are there not people in the world who are evil? Does evil exist? And if it does, is it part of some people?
What do you think, Julie?
I think circumstance. I don't think people are born evil, but I think their life circumstance maybe has them turn toward evil. That it grows in them as things happened in their lives, but they wind up being evil.
Okay.
I just watched a movie, I think it was called Among Wolves. And he was, the main character was a contract hitman. So he did a lot of evil things. But the one contract he couldn't fulfill was this young girl. And he ended up protecting her, giving his life so that she was free.
Spoiler
So
alert,
good
Katie.
thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's in my queue to watch. Now you ruined it. Thanks.
Oh,
And
you
everybody
still
who
have to
watches
see
the
it.
YouTube.
You still have to see it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Who else? What else? What do you think about evil? Julie asked the question. Does evil exist?
I don't know if I have an answer, but there's something I'm kind of obsessed by the nature imagery earlier on, Josh. I'll just make a quick reference to that.
Go for it.
In part 3 or section 3 of this sermon, the one that begins from all that I have attempted to say, below the Shakespeare quote, thank you, Martin Luther King, he says about evil, but somewhere along the way, the church must remind men that devoid of intelligence, goodness, and conscientiousness will become brutal forces leading to shameful crucifixions. They have a moral responsibility to be intelligent. I think what King is getting at is that evil appears to be one of these kind of implacable natural forces. It's just somehow it exists in the world, and in some way through society and through habit and a lack of intelligence, we see ourselves becoming a part of that impersonal world that's an eye for an eye, laws, a never-ending cycle of revenge. They bomb us, we bomb them. And I think the cycle must be broken, and I think that what Jesus tells us as a moment of enlightenment is to break that cycle, is to see something before us, the gift that we have ourselves. It's seeing the world as not an impersonal place, but we can't have an impact on any more than we could change gravity. I think that evil it's a part of the human world, not the natural world.
Yeah, let's tie this sermon into the next. Let's carry on this conversation into the next sermon. And more specifically, I want to get us into the spread of section 1. And in my book, it's page 50 and page 51. And it's the section that leads off, let us be practical and ask the question, how do we love our enemies? And we're just going to finish up in this one section of section 1. I have a few things I certainly want to share because I think it ties well. I think this section ties well to the first sermon. I have some things I want to share within it, and I want to make sure that we have time for any other thoughts that y'all want to share that have stimulated you here. This idea of how was it that Jesus was able to pray, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do? King has elevated the idea that when it matters the most, we take up action to pray for the other, and that we acknowledge that there are people made in the image of God who do evil and bad things, and yet they are still those who are made in the image of God. And that same person who's there on the cross, who has said, Father, forgive, who's taught us in that moment, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, has taught us earlier to love our enemies. And not only just taught it, but then in that moment has shown it in the prayer for them. And so King says in this first section, I'm on page 50, we must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. Woof. I mean, he just comes right out of the gate and talks about this idea of forgiving. He is devoid of the power to forgive, is devoid of the power to love. It is impossible even to begin the act of loving one's enemies without the prior acceptance of the necessity over and over again of forgiving those who inflict evil and injury upon us. Go down to the next paragraph. Forgiveness does not mean ignoring what has been done or putting a false label on an evil act. It means rather that the evil act no longer remains as a barrier to the relationship. Forgiveness is a catalyst creating the atmosphere necessary for a fresh start, a new beginning. It is the lifting of a burden or the canceling of a debt. One of the the book, the 66 books of the Bible, the canon of the Bible, is a closed canon. There will never be more that will be added to the canon. And one book that I've read in my life that upon the conclusion of reading it, I said, if there could be a 67th book, this would be my nomination for the 67th book of the Bible. And that is Desmond Tutu's. I don't know if this is coming through or not. I need to take a look. Desmond Tutu's No Future Without Forgiveness. Marcelo, have you read this one yet?
No, I got it from the library and I had other things I had to do, so I had to send it back, but it's
Yeah.
still on my list.
Desmond Tutu's No Future Without Forgiveness. And these 2 pages of what King has written is Desmond Tutu's No Future Without Forgiveness expounded. And part of what Tutu has done here is on the backside of apartheid. Apartheid comes to a close. Mandela in South Africa, Mandela has been set free. And not only has been set free, but he has been elected to serve as the president of South Africa and in a country that is in the desperate need of rebuilding. And the first Black president of South Africa after, I mean, just god awful decades, centuries, the entirety of its country of oppression and just horrible evils done in the name of racism. And the vision there is, how do we heal? And so what South Africa does is put together the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they enlist Desmond Tutu to be the chair of this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And his book here, No Future Without Forgiveness, writes about the horrors and the challenges of that process. I commend it to you. Again, if there could be a 67th book, well, it's chef's kiss. That being said, this is also what he is saying in that as well. You cannot love your enemies without inviting them to sit at the table with you, without seeking to have some intentional form of relationship. That does not mean, and I've shared this before with church members. It doesn't mean that you aren't a doormat, because Jesus was never a doormat. There are ways in which there's responsible ways in which we engage this. The next lines there, the words, I will forgive you, but I'll never forget what you've done, never explain the real nature of forgiveness. Certainly one can never forget if that means erasing it totally from his mind. But when we forgive, we forget in the sense that the evil deed is no longer a mental block and impeding a new relationship. Continuing, likewise, we can never say, I will forgive you, but I won't have anything further to do with you. Forgiveness means reconciliation, a coming together again. Without this, no man can love his enemies. Next paragraph. Second, we must recognize that the evil deed of the enemy neighbor, the thing that hurts, never quite expresses all that he is. An element of goodness may be found even in our worst enemy. Down to the next paragraph. When we look beneath the surface, beneath the impulsive evil deed, we see within our enemy neighbor a measure of goodness and know that the viciousness and evil of his acts are not quite representative of all that he is. We see him in a new light. We recognize that his hate grows out of fear, pride, ignorance, prejudice, and misunderstanding, or in his previous sermon, right, the blindness, intellectual and spiritual blindness. But in spite of this, we know God's image is inevitably etched in his being. Then we love our enemies by realizing that they are not totally bad and that they are not beyond the reach of God's redemptive love. There is a theological doctrine that John Calvin had uplifted, and it is the doctrine of total depravity. Are you familiar with the idea of total depravity?
No.
It's one of my favorite doctrines. The The doctrine of total depravity, Calvin argues, is that every bit of us is 100% totally depraved. That there is all of us, I mean, all of us and every bit of us is 100% totally corrupted by sin. Every bit of us. And that is what makes God's grace so remarkable and so phenomenal, that in our state of being so totally lost into depravity and sin, and the more depraved in which we are, and the capacity for depravity of which we are, makes the miraculousness of God's grace all the more powerful. And that is a doctrine that I've held, still hold. And I have found myself waning on it at times, that if I live, if I'm so totally depraved, how could there not be just some wiggle room for grace to enter in? And that there couldn't be some goodness, like what Kitty was saying with this movie. If you're just such a bad guy, how could there not be just some ounce of goodness that we could still work with? Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars still believed in Anakin. You know, I know there's good in him, right? You know,
Wrong.
right? But no, you know, that's what makes grace all the more awesome. Then we get to this next paragraph. Third, we must not seek to defeat or humiliate the enemy, but to win his friendship and understandings. At times, we are able to humiliate our worst enemy. Inevitably, his weak moments come, and we are able to thrust in his side the spear of defeat. And if you would allow me, I'd like to read the part from Desmond Tutu. He was giving a speech in Rwanda after he had finished the Truth and Reconciliation. And he writes in this speech in Rwanda, who itself was also having kind of this civil conflict between tribes and between within their state. And he was talking about this idea of revenge and retaliation, and you know, and sticking it to the man who finally we come in power, and we can stick it to them, and we're seething to be the victors, and drive what do you call it, the spear of defeat into the side of our enemies. And Tutu said, I said to the history of Rwanda was typical of a history of top dog and underdog. The top dog wanted to cling to its privileged position, and the underdog strove to topple the top dog. When that happened, the new top dog engaged in an orgy of retribution to pay back the new underdog for all the pain and suffering it had inflicted when it was the top dog. The new underdog fought like an enraged bull to topple the new top dog, storing in its memory all the pain and suffering it was enduring, forgetting that the new top dog was, in its view, only retaliating for all that it had remembered it had suffered when the underdog had been its master. It was a sad history of reprisal, provoking counter-reprisal. I reminded the Tutsi that they had waited for 30 years to get their own back for what they perceived to be the injustices they had been heaped on them. I said that extremists among the Hutu were also quite capable of waiting 30 years or more for the one day when they could topple the new government, in which the Tutsi would play a prominent role, and their turn to unleash a devastation of resentment and revenge. And so the cycle continues of top dog and underdog, the reprisals and the counter reprisals. And his idea is, I mean, what the point he's making here, much like what King is saying, is that when we are living in this cycle, it will never end. It is a Game of Thrones that is always spinning, and that at some point we must break it. And one of the success stories of the the Truth and Reconciliation Commission coming out of South Africa is that in a shorter period of time, they were able to achieve something in their country that the United States has never been able to achieve. They were able to err and to confess the ways in which they had been confess the ways in which they had done wrong, confess the ways in which they had sinned, confess the ways, and the people who were violated. King goes on to say, in the next page, let's see, was it in this one? I can't remember where it was. But at this one point, it was talking about in the idea of forgiveness that it is the one who is wronged. It is the one who is wrong is the one who needs to take the initiative to offer forgiveness. And that paved the way for a different kind of relationships to exist within a country that needed it so much more authentically and more rapidly than what has ever existed in the United States. And my belief is, and we still have the opportunity for a TRC to exist, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to exist in the United States. We just lack the courage to do so, because we have normalized, made systemic this idea of retribution and this top dog, underdog mentality. Any thoughts or takeaways from yourself with regard to the second loving your enemies sermon that you read, that you underscored, or from the first? We kind of had a lot to unpack tonight.
I have a question because I didn't understand it. It was page 45, and he's talking about blindness is found in racial segregation. But midway in the last paragraph, that some people will argue that God was the first segregationist. Redbirds and bluebirds don't fly together. I'm not familiar with that quote. And I can see the segregation in it, red and blue, black and white. Is that what he's talking about?
Yeah, that's a phrase I wasn't familiar with. I'm not familiar with. I'd have to look that one up. I'm not familiar with that one. I'm sorry, Kitty.
That's okay.
Any of y'all ever heard of that one? Red and bluebirds, redbirds, bluebirds. Yeah, I've never heard of that one. Red birds, bluebirds.
Sounds like Republicans and Democrats.
Ooh. Oh, ew. Oh. Oh. No. I'd have to look it up. I don't really.
Okay.
I'm looking at it right now on the Google, and it's talking about the idea of interracial marriage not being a good idea. I think that might be more of a vernacular. I don't really know. So, okay. Any other thoughts for tonight? Oh, is that Ramsey?
It was, yeah.
Yay.
She came in to get lightsabers to play, and apparently Mama did not agree to that.
You can tell Ramsey I missed her. I missed some Ramsey this morning. And Matthew, you may very well be the audience that Martin Luther King would love for you to read. And I'd love for you, as you're reading it, to be thinking about that he's specifically writing to you. I think that's a fun way to keep a headspace in. You may not be the marginalized group that he had in mind as he was writing, but you're having coffee with him and he's talking to you now. So read it that way and engage that way. And I think that's a fun way to have it. So, all right. Well, thank you, everybody. Let's, if somebody would be so willing to close us in prayer. I've provided some there. Did I? Yeah, I got one there.
Yes, I will.
Thanks, Kitty.
God grant that as we go out and face life with all of its decisions, as we face the bitter cup which we will inevitably face from day to day, God grant that we will learn this one thing, and that is to make the transition from this cup to nevertheless. Amen.
Man.
Amen.
All right. Blessings on you all. We'll see y'all next week. 6 and 7. Making our way. Adios, everybody.